Hello, this is lecture number 17 in a series called Thought as Word Dynamics. We've reached a stage where we need to define something that I will call objective reality. And this will be the title of this lecture. What is objective reality? We've been discussing how do you compose sentences. How do you use what I defined following in that Aristotle, the basic unit being of thought and of memory traces being a pair of words. How do you chain those in order to make sentences? And once you do that, what kind of conclusion do you reach? Having established that there's a basic difference, essential, crucial difference in that respect, in the ways that traditional Western thought and Eastern thought have proceeded, which I can characterize as being the same. Within Eastern classical thought, Chinese archaic being what I have in mind more specifically, every chaining of pairs of words is symmetrical. You can always go from one of the terms to the other and then from the other back to the first. While, and we don't know historically how that started within Western society, Western culture, you have a double possibility. You can have these symmetrical ways of chaining word pairs, and you have an anti-symmetrical, an example of symmetrical being the pharaoh has a pyramid and the pyramid has a pharaoh. That's symmetrical. And while you would have the fly is an insect and an insect is an animal. So there you have things which go in one direction and can go in that direction for a little while. And in the way our memory is organized, according to me, according to the theory I've been developing so far, in our memory we have both. While people belonging to that traditional Eastern culture would have had essentially these symmetrical ways of chaining thoughts. And last time in lecture number 16, I concentrated on the property which is proper to Western thought, that if you chain in a particular way, when I say in a particular way, I mean according to some cases which are possible and other cases which are forbidden, you produce typically the main brick, constituting brick of thought, which we call the syllogism. You come with two terms, you add another two terms with actually a middle term which is the same. So in all you have three terms, and you can produce a syllogism, a conclusion which says something more than what was included in the two sentences. And I underlined that what the more that is produced is the possibility for an element which is in a word pair to be associated to another element which is part of another word pair having an element in common. So you can go from, let's say, A to B, and if you have another word pair which is B to C, you found a way of connecting, which is called transition, the transitive operation. You found a way to connect A to C, and that's what the syllogism manages to do, which is to connect A to C through B. The whale is a mammal. Mammals feed their young with milk, and therefore the whale feeds its young with milk, which is a syllogism. And last time I stressed the difference between a syllogism and an analogy having 4 terms. If you're interested in all this, you can go back to lecture number 17, where I discussed this all in detail. A difficulty which is met in our culture and is the following, is that there is a difference between a discourse, some speech, some story, whatever somebody says. There's a difference between something which is not self-contradictory and something which is not contradictory with something else. And I give you just an example. You have 2 lawyers in court, and they will be each will be defending a client. And in order to be convincing, they both need not to be self-contradictory. They need to be coherent in what they say. It shouldn't be possible for the other party to say, well, you contradicted yourself when you said this. But what we know, and what the sophists in Greece, ancient Greece, already knew, it is quite possible, starting from similar or even same premises, to come to contradictory conclusions. And that's the art of a good lawyer, not to contradict himself or herself, and being convincing for that reason. But it's quite possible, and if the cases are well pleaded by both parties, that none of them self-contradicts, and that and despite that they come to contradictory conclusions. And what had happened in ancient Greece is that people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle became increasingly irritated by that possibility of not contradicting yourself, but coming to opposite conclusions which are opposed to that of someone else. They wanted to add a new criteria in order to get rid of that possibility that the sophists were defending, who were skeptics for that reason, that you can establish one thing and the contrary without any difficulty, and that it's extremely difficult it's extremely difficult to tell which one is better than the other. I go back to my text, and I take it some 2 minutes before I ended last time, in order to be able to chain on what comes next. The anti-symmetric nature of what is called the logos, and properly so called, which is a sentence that goes in one direction and not in the other, which is not symmetrical, encourages the concatenation of of these clauses. Any clause acts as a pointer to further chaining. This potentiality soon raises the question of the compatibility of subsequent clauses, as it can be observed that sense may diverge, so that speeches starting from the same premises turn out to be incompatible, i.e. claim states of affairs which are contradictory. Here lies the crux of the quarrel between Socrates and the sophists. Here lies surprisingly the roots of what became known under the name of philosophy. The ancient Chinese had ignored the anti-symmetric clause, which is the reason why the richness of the intertwining of the hereditary and endogenous fields was close to them. Hereditary is through these things that can trickle down, being anti-symmetrical, not symmetrical, and the endogenous is these crisscrossing connections that may exist between other elements. The Greek proposed different types of solutions to this intellectual difficulty, to be used on their own or in combination, through division, formalization, or ostensive fit. Plato came up with a first way of approaching the difficulty of the sophists of the contradictory statement, although they're not self-contradictory when they're produced and seem to start from the same premises. Plato, number one. Plato advocates or simply reports, because the issue is unclear, whether he reports his theory developed already by somebody else. Probably not by Socrates, because he would have mentioned it. Plato advocates the method of what he calls division, or closer to the Greek, dichotomy, which consists of solving a question through consecutive choices between alternatives. The difficulties involved are those of ensuring that one is dealing at every stage of division with an exhaustive contrast set of only two terms. You need, in order to use the method of division of Plato, the choice must always be between two alternatives, black or white, not black, white, or gray. Aristotle noted the underlying assumption, which he regarded as unwarranted, that any classification amounts to a dichotomous tree and ends up out of necessity with a number of labels being there a power of 2. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. Aristotle supported, however, the use of the division method as a useful tool for the purpose of definition, to a large extent what we would call heuristics. It's a good method that you can use. Say it's either this or that, and if it's that, then it may be either this or that. But of course, you can add or a third possibility or a fourth possibility in that case, and then you don't have that simply the simple division between in a tree with always two branches of the alternative, the dichotomy. Second, other approach. The question of compatibility can alternatively be faced head-on. If one defines the possible joins between subsequent clauses so that, starting from identical premises, like lawyers would do in the case in court, it is only possible to reach identical ultimate statements, whatever the length of the concatenation of clauses. It is only possible to reach identical ultimate statements. This leads to drastically reduce the number of operators within the clause and joins between clauses to those that can account for a truth table, what we call now a truth table in logic. Truth being here understood in a manner independent of the content provided in the sentence by the predicate and subject. Thus, an embryo of formal logic is being developed, but also an axiomatic mathematics, if one wishes. The question of compatibility can also be approached indirectly. Let each associative chain, sentence, whatever discourse, be submitted to the test of one external criterion, so that if it successfully passes the test, one is guaranteed that no two sequences of clauses starting from the same premises will turn out to be contradictory. The method consists of, and you will not be surprised because it's become so common, the idea, the method consists of assessing the truth or falseness of each individual associative chain, of each individual proposition, of each individual sentence. The way to ensure the truth of a clause is that it depicts the world as it stands, telling the truth about the world, i.e. that the words match the state of affairs being described. There would be two ways to say the truth, either asserting the truth of what is true or asserting the falseness of what is false. And the first historical account we have of that is the one which is offered by Plato in one of his dialogues, the one called The Sophist, not accidentally called The Sophist, because as we as just suggested, what was tried upon by Plato was to refute the skeptic view of the sophist that one thing and its contradictory could be proven with the same ease without it being possible to distinguish one from the other, because the sophists were not resorting to any idea of an objective truth that would apply to individual sentences. In this dialogue, you have two, at that part of the dialogue, explaining for the first time in Western culture what is the truth, what is truth and falseness. You have two people in in the dialogue. The stranger, because we don't know in the dialogue who he is, he seems to come from Ilea, as far as I remember, and you have a character called Theaetetus. I'll call him T because his name is quite complicated, and I will say the stranger and T. The stranger. A sentence must and cannot help having a subject. And you ask Theaetetus whether it's true. And T says it is true. The stranger says, and must be of a certain quality. T replies, certainly. The stranger says, I will repeat a sentence to you in which a thing and an action are combined by the help of a noun and a verb. And you shall tell me of whom the sentence speaks. T says, I will to the best of my power. And the stranger says, Theaetetus sits. This is not a very long sentence. Theaetetus agrees, yes, not very. The stranger, of whom does the sentence speak, and who is the subject? That is what you have to tell me. And T says, it speaks of me, I'm the subject. The stranger then says, of this sentence again, Theaetetus, with whom I'm now speaking, is flying. And T says, that also is a sentence which will be admitted by everyone to speak of me and to apply it to me. Stranger says then, we agreed that every sentence must necessarily have a certain quality. T says, yes. The stranger says, and what is the quality of each of these two sentences? And T says, the one as I imagine is false, and the other is true. The stranger says, the true says what is true about you? Theaetetus says, yes. Stranger, and the false says what is other than true? And Theaetetus says, yes. And the stranger then asks, and therefore speaks of things which are not as if they were. That's true, says Theaetetus. Saying something false is speaking of things which are not as if they were. The stranger concludes, when other than is asserted of you as the same and not being as being, such a combination of nouns and verbs is really and truly false discourse. And Theaetetus agree, this is indeed the case. This is the first time, and there's a systematic attempt in our culture to show the difference between true and false. A demonstration there by Plato in a dialogue where he stages two characters, and where it is concluded that saying of things what they are is truth, and saying of things not what they are not is falseness. Truth would obtain when the clause depicts the world as it stands. This raises in turn the question of how to assess that the words fit the state of affairs we're talking about. The potential for perceptual illusion, what the Greek called a phenomenon, that's an illusion, prevents from simply comparing what is being said with what the word looks like, as this can be deceptive. There can be illusions. The things look to being one way, although they're not. This latter difficulty, the possibility of illusion, can be dealt with on one condition: that is supposed beyond the world of appearances another world, more sturdy, exempt from deception, such that truth can be judged with respect to it. Such an assumed world amounts to what will be called later on an objective reality. The real, if one wishes to call it that way. But starting from in the 16th century, essentially, the new generation of scientists will talk about what can be summarized as being the objective reality. The truth describes the objective reality in the terms that apply. by not saying the contrary of what being is being there as part of that objective reality. These notions go without saying for us, but they were built patiently starting in ancient times with an amazing amount of work from the medieval scholars, which unfortunately is entirely ignored now, as if they had done all that job. And the first true scientists in the 16th, 17th century then developed these views, and with this idea of science being the description, the accurate description of objective reality. The description and explanation of objective reality would from then on define the program of the scientific enterprise. Within it, the two methods for ensuring a priori the compatibility of subsequent associative chains, sentences, propositions, would be combined. One, the fit between the word and the thing would be attained through the systematic resort to experimentation. In order to eliminate the possibility of an illusion, you experiment. You put an experimental configuration in place, and you look what happens when you modify slightly the conditions around. And that makes it possible, in particular, to eliminate little by little the possibility of illusion. Number two, while the overall compatibility of statements would redundantly be guaranteed by the modeling through mathematics and formalized logic, we develop from then on tools which will be watertight in terms of the possibility of maintaining non-contradictory conditions, that there's no self-contradiction within a discourse that develops. And that's what, for instance, happens in the mathematical demonstration. The conditions are there around to prevent that a contradiction appears in the development of the argument. When it does, and it's not seen, then we have these quarrels like remain currently about whether there is a contradiction or not in the demonstration by Kurt Gödel of his famous second theorem about the inconsistency of arithmetics. As you may know, in parallel and in writings I've produced, I do claim, along with some other people who have recently joined me in the discussion, that there is a contradiction in the development of the demonstration by Gödel of his second theorem. Okay, but this is it for today, for lecture number 17 in that series of lectures called Thought as Word Dynamics. I'll see you soon for starting the third and final part, which is called the dynamics of memory, which is important to know if you want to produce something of a type of a bottom-up type of artificial intelligence, as I started doing in the late 80s when I worked for British Telecom on the as part of the Connex project, it was called, on the piece of software, of artificial intelligence software, which was called ANELA, standing for Associative Network with Emergent Logic and Learning Abilities. More about that starting in lecture number 18. I'll see you soon, hopefully, for that lecture and the one that will follow until we reach a final conclusion around lecture number 25, possibly, probably. I'll see you soon, hopefully.